We awoke the following morning with no sign of the rain from the previous day, and the clouds and mist cleared. We were able to see the hills we had crossed to get to this point, and as if a line had been drawn between the previous day and the day to come, there was a stark contrast between the rusty, snow-strewn peaks to the north and the mossy valleys of the south. After spending a lazy hour at the shore, looking out across the mirrored waters of Altvarten, we decided to break down camp and find a spot for breakfast somewhere down the trail. The day promised more river crossings and the vast volcanic plains of Meyerfellsende. We set off and moved east, up and over the small saddle between the hills that flanked the lake, and as we took the narrow path that gradually descended the other side, we were greeted by the stunning views of jagged, isolated mountains, and far off in the distance, the expansive glaciers of the Katla volcano. And after a couple of miles, we decided to procrastinate on our first river crossing of the day to eat some food and brew some coffee, occasionally glancing to the south towards the snowy range that we were hoping to reach in a few days' time. The day ahead was going to mostly be flat with the occasional river crossing, but I started to feel a little nervous about the mountains that dominated the horizon in the distance, and wondered how I'd handle the climb after 3 days of constant walking. But there were many miles between now and then, and the more immediate challenges were the rivers still ahead of us. At the first crossing of the day, feeling energized from our morning coffee, we splashed our way lazily across. The water was slow-moving and surprisingly cool, owing to the fact that it was shallow and had had a chance to warm up in the sun as it zigzagged down from the mountains above. On the far bank, we turned south, using the distant lone peak of Storasula as our orientation. After refilling our water bottles at a stream, we decided to take another, less earned break to do some exploring without the burden of our heavy packs. But before long, we continued onwards, down the gentle slopes and across the trickling streams, and as we trudged further into the valley, the stunted grasses and moss eventually gave way to more rocky terrain, which required a more cautious footing. The small tributaries we'd been crossing all morning would eventually confluence at a much larger river that was thankfully bridged. But a kilometre away, further down the route, was another crossing. Up till now, I'd either left the camera on the starting bank, recording the crossing and then going back for it, or simply held it in hand as I crossed. This river, however, was far too wide, deep, and fast-flowing to risk either crossing 3 times total to get the shot I'd like, or by holding the camera as I crossed, as I needed both hands free for balance. We eventually found a good place to cross and waded our way to the far bank. Once safe on the other side, I dried off and took care of the blisters that had started to form on my feet. The miles were starting to add up, and my feet were feeling it the most. But the day was far from over, so there was nothing to do but press on. With black volcanic rock and sand stretched to the horizon, and the sun rising to its zenith, we walked for what felt like hours, occasionally stopping to rest and hydrate in the sparse shade afforded by the small boulders and mounds. Far off to the south, dark clouds swirled above the mountains of Thorsmork, obscuring their peaks, and a single dirt bike raced across the volcanic desert, giving me a pang of jealousy as I walked with aching feet, the mountains that marked the end of the plain not seeming to get any larger. After what should have been a simple stream crossing that nearly ended in soggy feet and hurt egos. Nearly. Yeah. I did catch that, yeah. Don't put my foot where you did. We eventually reached a river that had sliced a deep gully through the sun-baked rocks of the volcanic desert. I refilled my water, and after a short break spent in awe of the power of the torrent, we set off again, the end of the day feeling a lot closer. As we approached the end of the plain, I turned back one last time. Upon seeing the red mountains far to the north, I was able to appreciate just how far we'd come. But as I recalled the full route, tracing out our path in my head, I realized just how far there was still left to go. As we left the valley and moved between the more closely grouped lower hills beyond, we were blessed with a refreshing and welcome downpour after the long hours in the heat of the sun. But before we reached camp for the night, we were greeted with one last amazing scene. The deep black obsidian stones, now slick with rain, glistened in the shafts of light that were breaking through the clouds and gave the impression of being coated in ice. We set up camp among the rocky hills of Emstra and fell asleep to the sounds of rain falling from the clouds that now blanketed the sky overhead. While having very little ascent, this leg of the journey wasn't without its challenges, mainly the river crossing. We had to assess the area and look for the best place to cross, deciding that the track that was used by vehicles to ford the river would likely have a deeper bed due to the weight of the vehicles, so we decided to move upstream. In Death Stranding, the environment contains information left by other players in the form of paths. This is true of river crossings in the game as well. Even without scanning the water's surface, you can generally tell where it's safer to cross from the worn areas on the banks created by the numerous other players who have crossed in that spot. For us, however, there was no visible paths other than the track used by vehicles which we'd already ruled out. However, a chance encounter with a pair of hikers moving in the opposite direction meant they were able to show us the point at which they had crossed, and with that information we were able to follow their proven route to get safely to the other side. Other than the occasional porter, you will always primarily be reliant on these echoes of other players in the game world to help you navigate. Similarly, we were able to connect with the other travelers to help with our own navigation. The next morning, we set off from Emstra, with the goal of reaching the wooded valleys of Thorsmork by the day's end. And, as with yesterday, the first item on the agenda was food and coffee. We perched up on top of a hill that overlooked the basin below to boil our water and could hear the roar of an out-of-sight river. And as we descended the slope, making sure not to slip on the loose rubble underfoot, we took in the views of the Myrtalsjökull ice cap of Katla to the north, whose meltwater was the source of the cascade below. We scrambled up the gorge that had been hewn out of the rock by the rapids, and paused to take a moment and appreciate once again the unbelievable scale and beauty of the scene before us. We then accompanied the river as it carved its way downwards, stopping only briefly to fill our water bottles at a stream that was feeding the larger river below. We continued on, the walls of the basin surrounding us on all sides, tinted in reds, greens, and blacks, until eventually we reached a crag at the southernmost point. We climbed up slowly, with the rolling hills and glaciers as our backdrop. Once atop the cliff, the land opened out into a large flat shelf. The river now unseen below us, but its footprint still visible as the mountains conformed to its path towards the ocean. The wind was brisk, but we had started to get a little hungry, so decided to take shelter behind some boulders and have ourselves a second breakfast. The day was far from over yet, and we would be following the Markafjorda River that had been our guide for the day, until we would go our separate ways, turning south towards Thorsmork as it continued west on its 62-mile journey to the sea. It was at this point in the trip, traipsing through the desert, that I started to understand the feeling of isolation that Death Stranding presents, and why Iceland is the perfect place to emulate if you want the natural world in your game to convey this wordlessly. We're told through the dialogue that humanity is clinging on by a thread, and are holed up in the last islands of civilization. But it's the world itself that really paints this picture of desperation and isolation. And the world in Death Stranding isn't just a snapshot of different biomes condensed into a playable open world, but is a true reflection of the geological diversity seen in Iceland. We had been walking for 2.5 days at this point, and the differences in terrain would often change dramatically from one valley to the next, or just a few miles apart. And while its inhospitable nature is the perfect backdrop for a game like Death Stranding, its beauty is also anything but bleak.